She was 61 years old when she counted out the last of her money on a kitchen table that was no longer hers and found that it came to $11.40. Her name was Adeline Foss, and the man who had taken everything else from her was a soft-spoken clerk named Harlan Beaumont, who had smiled at her for 2 years while he emptied her pension into an account that did not exist. She had nothing left but a satchel, a coat too thin for the coming winter, and those $11. So when she heard that the railroad yard outside a half-forgotten town called Millbrook Junction was selling off a derelict boxcar for scrap, rusted through, forgotten on a dead spur of track for 11 years, she paid every last coin she had for it. The yard foreman called her a fool. Her own sister called it madness. But sealed inside that rusted car, behind a wall that should not have existed, was something that would not only give Adeline back everything she had lost, but would return to an entire forgotten town a piece of its history it did not know was missing. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Adeline Foss. If you have ever felt discarded by the very people who are supposed to look after you, tell us where you're watching from in the comments. We'd love to know we're not alone in feeling forgotten sometimes. Adeline Foss had been born in 1841 in a river town in Ohio, the daughter of a wheelwright named Samuel Foss, a man whose hands were always stained black with axle grease and whose voice, when he spoke of his work, took on the reverence other men reserved for scripture. Adeline was the second of 4 children, but the only one who ever lingered in her father's workshop past the point where curiosity became apprenticeship. While her brothers ran wild along the riverbank and her sister Constance learned needlework from their mother, Adeline learned the weight of iron, the smell of hot pitch, the particular silence that fell over a workshop when a joint was cut true and fit without complaint. Samuel Foss used to say that most people looked at a broken wheel and saw trash, but a wheelwright looked at the same wheel and saw which 3 pieces of it were still good, and built the rest around them. It was, he told her, the only kind of wisdom worth having, the ability to see what remained valuable in a thing everyone else had given up on. That lesson planted itself in Adeline in a way she would not fully understand until she was an old woman standing before a rusted train car with her whole fortune spent. But even as a girl, she carried it with her like a second name. When the other children discarded broken toys, Adeline collected them and mended what she could. When a neighbor's barn cat had kittens no one wanted, she found homes for every one of them by insisting, quietly and stubbornly, that each animal had worth simply by existing. Her mother despaired that she would never make a proper wife, too plain-spoken, too fond of tools and ledgers and other people's cast-offs. But her father only laughed and said the world did not have enough people willing to look twice at what it threw away. She married at 23, a good and unremarkable man named Elias Kirtland, a railway surveyor whose work took them steadily westward over the following decades, following the spreading iron veins of the American Railroad as it pushed through Ohio, into Indiana, and finally into the wide, wind-scoured plains of Kansas, where they settled for a time near a town that no longer exists under that name. Elias was a patient man who admired his wife's stubborn eye for value, and together they raised 2 children, a son named Thomas who grew up to work the rails himself, and a daughter, Mary, who married young and moved further west before Adeline had properly said goodbye. When the railroad company Elias worked for finally offered him a pension in 1884 after 30 years of faithful surveying, it seemed to Adeline that they had, at long last, arrived at the quiet harbor that a long working life was supposed to earn a person. But harbors, as Adeline would learn, are not always safe simply because they are calm. Elias died in the winter of 1889, his heart failing quietly in his sleep after a life spent mostly outdoors in weather that would have killed a lesser man decades earlier. Adeline grieved him with the same unhurried dignity with which she had loved him, and found herself, at 58, a widow with a modest pension, a small house in a railway town, and children scattered too far to visit more than once a year. It was, she told herself, a survivable sorrow. She had her home. She had her small, steady income. She believed, enough. It was this belief, this quiet, hard-won sufficiency, that Harlan Beaumont would take from her, one soft word at a time. He arrived in her town in the spring of 1893, a well-dressed man in his 40s who represented himself as an agent of a respectable Chicago investment concern, offering widows and retired railway men the chance to see their modest pensions grow through careful placement in government bonds and rail shares. He was patient with Adeline in a way that flattered her, listening to her stories of Elias and the wheelwright father who had raised her, nodding along as though her small history mattered to him. He was, in short, exactly the kind of man a lonely, dignified woman does not think to suspect. Over the course of 18 months, Adeline signed over the management of her pension payments to Beaumont's firm in increments, so small and so reasonable sounding that she scarcely noticed the total until the spring of 1895, when she went to the bank to draw against her account and was told, with the particular gentleness reserved for delivering ruin, that the account held $4.16. Beaumont, of course, was gone. The firm's Chicago office turned out to be a rented room above a dry goods store, vacated the week before. The local sheriff was sympathetic and entirely without recourse. Men like Beaumont, he told her wearily, moved through a dozen towns a year, and there was no law fast enough to catch them before the money had scattered to the wind. Adeline's own son Thomas offered to take her in, but his railway wages barely stretched to cover his own family in a cramped company house 2 states away, and Adeline, whose whole life had been built on the dignity of not being a burden, could not bring herself to become one now. So it was that in the late summer of 1895, at 61 years old, Adeline Foss Kirtland found herself with a satchel of clothes, a small tin box of her husband's old surveying notes that she could not bear to sell, and $11.40 to her name, standing on the platform of a train she could not afford to ride, in a town she had already given notice to leave. She took work where she could find it, mending, laundry, and autumn spent plucking chickens for a farmer's wife who paid her in eggs and pity, and drifted, as the desperate often do, toward the cheapest corners of the cheapest towns, until she came to rest in Millbrook Junction, a fading railway town in eastern Kansas that had once been a busy stop on a branch line and was now mostly a collection of weathered buildings clustered around a depot that saw 2 trains a week instead of the 12 it had once served. It was here, behind the depot, on a rusted spur of disused track choked with sunflowers and Johnson grass, that she first saw the boxcar. It had been sitting there, by the accounts of everyone in town, for at least 11 years, a relic of a defunct freight line, its wheels seized with rust, its wooden siding silvered and split by weather, one door hanging from a single remaining hinge. The railroad's regional office had finally sent word that the whole spur was to be cleared for scrap, and the yard foreman, a broad, tired man named Corwin Vance, had been given the unglamorous task of disposing of what remained. He was calling for bids on the car itself, more out of procedure than expectation, assuming it would go for its weight in scrap iron to whichever junk dealer wanted the trouble of hauling it away. Adeline stood before that boxcar on a hot September afternoon and felt something she had not felt since her father's workshop, the old, familiar pull of a thing everyone else had dismissed. She could not have said, standing there, what drew her to it beyond the shape of the price. Vance, half joking, told her she could have it for whatever was in her pocket, since no one else had bothered to bid and the company mostly wanted it gone before the rains came. She emptied her satchel of its $11.40 onto the tailgate of his wagon, and Corwin Vance, more amused than anything, wrote her out a bill of sale for one derelict boxcar, as is, on a hillside spur behind the Millbrook Junction depot. The whole yard laughed, not unkindly, but with the particular pity reserved for people whom life has clearly beaten. An old woman with nothing left to her name had spent her very last cent on a rotting hulk of iron and wood that could not so much as keep out the rain. Even Vance, walking away, muttered that she'd have been smarter to spend it on a room for the winter. But Adeline did not hear foolishness in her own decision. She heard her father's voice, 40 years gone, telling her that most people looked at a broken thing and saw trash, while a wheelwright looked at the same thing and saw which 3 pieces were still good. She spent that first night inside the boxcar with a borrowed lantern and a horse blanket a farmer's wife had taken pity enough to lend her, and it was in the flickering light of that lantern, running her hands along the car's interior walls out of habit more than purpose, that she noticed the boards on the northern end did not sit quite flush with the rest. There was a seam where no seam belonged, a section of wall perhaps 4 feet wide that had been built out from the original siding by no more than 3 inches, framed and finished so carefully that in daylight it would have passed for nothing more than a repair. But Adeline Foss had spent her childhood learning to read the language of built things, and she knew, with a certainty that raised the hair on her arms, that someone had constructed a false wall inside that boxcar, and had done it with care, and had done it on purpose. It took her the better part of 2 days, working with a bent pry bar she found rusting in the weeds and the patience her father had bred into her before she could properly speak, to work the boards free without splintering them entirely. What she found behind them was not treasure in the way the word is usually meant. There was no chest of gold, no sack of coin. What she found was a shallow compartment lined with oiled canvas gone brittle with age, and inside it, wrapped with the same careful, deliberate hand that had built the wall, a leather satchel much like her own, containing a bundle of yellowed papers, a small wooden case, and a woman's cameo brooch pinned through a folded letter. The letter was dated the 14th of March, 1884, and it was addressed with aching simplicity, "To whoever finds this, if I do not return." It had been written by a woman named Rosalind Atwater, and as Adeline read deeper into the papers that night by lantern light, the story that unfolded before her was one that Millbrook Junction itself had half forgotten, though it had once nearly torn the town apart. Rosalind Atwater had been the daughter of the very railroad official who oversaw this branch line's construction in the early 1880s, a man named Julius Atwater who had, according to the documents in that satchel, quietly diverted company funds meant for a promised spur line that would have connected Millbrook Junction to a second rail line 11 miles east, a connection the town had been promised, had built its expansion and its hopes around, and which had never come, dooming Millbrook to the slow decline it had suffered ever since. Rosalind, it seemed, had discovered her father's fraud, along with the original surveys, the falsified expense ledgers, and a signed letter from Julius Atwater's own hand admitting the diversion of nearly $6,000 in construction funds meant for the town. Rather than destroy the evidence to protect her father, or hand it to a company she no longer trusted to do right by it, Rosalind had hidden it, sealing it into the wall of this very boxcar, a car her father used for his private inspections of the line, intending, her letter said, to bring it before the town council once she had gathered the courage to face what exposing her own father would mean for her family. She had never gotten the chance. A note appended to the bundle in a different, later hand, Corwin Vance's own predecessor as yard foreman, as Adeline would eventually learn, recorded that Rosalind Atwater had died of a fever that same spring of 1884 before she ever spoke a word of what she'd found, and her father had left Millbrook Junction within the year. The boxcar shunted onto its dead spur and gradually forgotten along with the promise it contained. Adeline sat with that letter for a long while in the lantern light, feeling the peculiar vertigo of holding, in her 2 hands, both a decade-old tragedy and the means, perhaps, to set something right that had been wrong for 11 years. She thought of her father's workshop, of wheels that looked ruined until you found the 3 good spokes still hiding among the wreckage. She thought that Rosalind Atwater, whoever she had been, had wanted this evidence found by someone willing to finish what she could not, and Adeline decided, with the same quiet stubbornness that had once found homes for unwanted kittens, that she would be that someone. The following weeks were not easy ones. Millbrook Junction, it turned out, was not a town eager to be told that its long decline traced back to a fraud committed by a man most residents barely remembered. When Adeline brought the documents to the town's aging mayor, a cautious man named Otis Kellerman, he received her with polite disbelief, suggesting gently that an old woman living in a boxcar might be mistaken about what she had found, or worse, might be inventing a story to gain some sympathy or advantage. Word spread through town faster than she could counter it, and not kindly. Some called her a fantasist, others a schemer, and a few, including a prosperous grain merchant named Ezra Pruitt who had quietly profited from cheap land purchased during the town's decline, argued loudly at the general store that dredging up old railroad business would only bring unwanted scrutiny and do the town more harm than good. Pruitt, it would later become clear, had reasons of his own to want the Atwater documents to stay buried, having built a portion of his fortune buying distressed properties from families who left after the promised spur line never materialized. But Adeline had survived worse than town gossip. She had survived Harlan Beaumont's smiling theft of everything she owned, and she had learned, in the bitter months since, that dignity was not the same thing as silence. She wrote to the railroad's regional headquarters directly, enclosing careful copies of the ledgers she had found, and she wrote to a newspaperman in the county seat whose paper had once, years before, run a brief and unsatisfying account of the spur line's cancellation. She spoke, patiently and without embellishment, to anyone in Millbrook Junction who would listen, laying the original documents before them and letting the dead woman's own careful handwriting make the case that Adeline herself was too tired and too plain-spoken to argue. It was the newspaperman, a sharp, curious young man named Devereux Hale, who finally broke the story properly, traveling to Millbrook Junction to examine the documents himself and confirming, through railroad records he obtained in the county seat, that Julius Atwater had indeed been quietly dismissed from the company in 1884 under circumstances the railroad had never publicly explained, a dismissal, it turned out, that had been paired with a private, unpublicized repayment arrangement that the company had used ever since to avoid admitting fault publicly while recovering only a portion of the stolen funds. The company, faced now with Rosalind Atwater's own damning letter and the original ledgers, could no longer pretend the matter had been properly settled. Under mounting pressure from Hale's published account and a handful of Millbrook residents who organized, for the first time in a decade, to demand accountability, the railroad agreed to finally honor a version of its old promise. Not the original spur line, impossible to justify after so many years, but a formal settlement, including funds for a proper depot repair, a new grain platform the farmers had needed for years, and a stipend set aside for the town's aging and its poor, among whom Otis Kellerman insisted over Ezra Pruitt's loud objections. Adeline Foss Kirtland herself must be counted first, both for the discovery and for the pension she had lost to another man's fraud entirely unrelated to this one. Ezra Pruitt did not go quietly. He argued before the town council that Adeline had no legal claim to speak for the town, that the documents might be forged, that an old drifting woman ought not to be dictating Millbrook Junction's business. But the ledgers were in Julius Atwater's own hand, verified against company records Hale had gathered, and Rosalind's letter carried a grief and honesty that no forger could easily counterfeit. When the railroad settlement was finally announced at a town meeting that autumn, Pruitt sat in the back row in a silence more damning than any argument, and it was noted by more than one resident that his own quiet profiteering from the town's old misfortune had been laid uncomfortably bare in the telling of the whole affair, even without a single accusation aimed directly at him. He would leave Millbrook Junction himself within the year, his standing in the town irreparably diminished, not by punishment exactly, but by the simple, corrosive weight of a community finally seeing him clearly. Adeline did not ask for a fortune, and did not receive one. But the settlement stipend was enough, with careful management, to secure her a small, sound house at the edge of town, and enough left besides that she was able to do something that mattered to her far more than comfort. She used a portion of it to repair the very depot platform Rosalind Atwater's father had once meant to fund, and she asked, in the quiet, unassuming way that had always been hers, that a small brass plaque be set into the new platform's beam, bearing Rosalind Atwater's name and the dates of her short life, so that the woman who had hidden the truth rather than let it die with her would not be forgotten a second time. The boxcar itself, that rusted, laughed-at hulk she had bought for $11.40, could not be salvaged as a train car any longer, its wheels too far gone and its purpose long since ended. But Adeline had it moved, with the town's help and no small effort, to a spot beside the depot, where it was repaired and repainted and turned into a small museum room holding the very documents that had been found inside it, along with a short written account of Rosalind Atwater's discovery and Adeline's own patient unraveling of the truth. Children from the town school would come, in the years that followed, to stand inside that car and hear the story of the woman who wrote a letter she was afraid to deliver and the older woman who, decades later, delivered it for her. It is worth pausing here before we close the story to return to where we began. An $11 boxcar, a scammed pension, a woman of 61 with nothing left but her father's old lesson about broken wheels. Adeline Foss Kirtland never recovered the money Harlan Beaumont stole from her, and he was never caught, so far as any record shows. But she recovered something else, something her father had always insisted mattered more. The plain, stubborn ability to look at what the world called worthless and see, instead, what remained good enough to build upon. She had done it with kittens as a girl. With her husband's old surveying notes, she refused to sell even when hungry, and finally, improbably, with a rusted boxcar that everyone but her had been ready to see melted down for scrap. In restoring Rosalind Atwan's forgotten truth to the town that needed it, she had restored, almost as a quiet accident, her own place in the world as well. Adeline Foss Kirtland lived in Millbrook Junction for 11 more years, long enough to see the new depot platform bustling again with grain wagons, long enough to see Devereux Hale return more than once to write further, kinder stories about the town's slow recovery, and long enough to know that the $11.40 she had once counted out in despair had, in the end, bought her something no amount of stolen pension money ever could have, a place, finally and fully, where she belonged. We began this story with an old woman standing before a rusted train car, scammed of everything she had, laughed at for spending her last coin on a rotting hulk of iron and wood. We end it with a plaque bearing a dead woman's name set into a rebuilt platform, a town restored to something like its promise, and a woman who taught herself, and then quietly taught an entire community, that value is so often hidden exactly where the rest of us have already stopped looking. Thank you for spending this time with Adeline's story. If it moved you, we'd be grateful if you shared it with someone who might need reminding that they are not as forgotten as they feel. We'd love to know, what is a time you found real value in something everyone else had written off? Tell us in the comments below. Until next time, stay close.